Hello, everyone, and welcome to the webcast. My name is Christine Jersey Davis. I'm the Executive Director of the Ohio chapter of the American Planning Association, and I am your webcast moderator. Today is Friday, June 6th, and we will hear utility scale renewable energy. Good topic. All right. For technical help during today's webcast, you can type your questions in the Q&A box, and I'll do my best to answer those. For content questions related to the presentation, again, type them in the Q&A box. We'll get to those at the end of the presentation during the Q&A. Coming up on your screen is a list of our sponsoring APA chapters and divisions for 2025. Thanks to all those participating sponsors for making these webcasts possible and free to members. Today, we are hosted by our dear friends over at the Michigan chapter of APA. So thanks to you all for hosting and for being part of our consortium family. Next up on your screen is a list of our next 3 upcoming sessions. You can register for these and all of our sessions by heading to our website, ohioplanning.org/planningwebcast. This session has been approved for 1.5 CM credits and 1 of the Sustainability and Resilience credits for AICP. So if you need to log those, head over to planning.org, log into your My APA account, and from there you can search by today's event number or title, both of which can be found again on our website, ohioplanning.org/planningwebcast. If you're on social media, be sure to like us on Facebook. That's where I post any important date or time changes, when new sessions are available for you to register for, and a weekly reminder of what's on tap. We record all of our sessions and we post them to our YouTube channel. So head to youtube.com/planningwebcast will pop up along with our well over 500 session recordings, all available to you for free. So be sure to subscribe to our channel so that you get notified when a new session recording has been posted. Last thing, you can snap a picture of that QR code or head over to our website to sign up for our mailing list. I email 1 time a month. I promise it is just once a month. And it's a reminder of the sessions that are available for you to register for and the sessions that are coming up that month. So you can join our mailing list to receive that 1 email a month if you like for free. Okay, that's the end of my housekeeping items. Again, if you have questions, type them in that Q&A box. We'll get to them at the end during the designated Q&A. Please don't raise your hand because I will not answer. Just type something in and we will do our best to get to it. All right, I am going to stop sharing my screen now, and I'm going to turn it over to you, Sarah, to kick things off.
Excellent. Thank you, Christine. And I also want to thank the Michigan Association of Planning for nominating us to be part of this and setting this up and telling you kind of our story about Michigan's approach to planning and zoning. So we will talk about utility scale renewable energy for the next hour and a half. But if you want the full extended version, you've got to take the 3-hour Renewable Energy Academy that we have here. So we're really just more or less going to focus on the tools that we've developed over time. But first, I should let you know who we are. So with me here is my colleague, Madeline Kroll. She's the Clean Energy Land Use Specialist at the Center for Empowering Communities at the University of Michigan, and I am the director here. Our center is relatively small. You can see all 4 of our staff. We have also an amazing stream of students. And our goal is to support local governments, that's what we mean by communities, across the urban-rural spectrum as they leverage decarbonization opportunities to advance their goals and enhance quality of life. Madeline and I, and to some extent Olivia, really focus on the rural side of that spectrum where utility scale renewables are being cited. Our colleague Sarah Lee really focuses on programming for the more urban communities in the state. And so her work might be a topic of a future webinar. Madeline and I are both planners by training. My PhD is in farmland preservation. I am also faculty at University of Michigan's Urban and Regional Planning program. Madeline has a master's in an undergrad in spatial planning. And so we're happy to share with you today. Our agenda for today is really going to be talking about that evolution of programming in the state of Michigan and really give you a glimpse into how we think about planning and zoning renewables. We'll highlight content-wise elements that we think are particularly transferable, but more so, what we wanted to do was walk you through the tools and resources that we've developed over the course of the last 7 years that we think might be adapted to your state. Because one of the things that we see from Michigan is that folks really like to know kind of how it works here. And so there might be national tools available, but we really try to work and help them understand what it means in the policy context of Michigan, which you'll learn about in a little bit. As well as kind of the scale and market for large scale renewables in the state. All of this work, really, if you go to the next slide, Madeline, all of this work really started out of an early partnership with Michigan's State Energy Office. So you might hear us talk about EGLE, that's our Department for Environment, Great Lakes and Energy, but that is where our state energy program, the State Energy Office, sits. And these state energy offices are in all of the states, to the best of my knowledge. They get funding from DOE. In many states, they sit in different offices. So you would want to kind of check out what your kind of where your state energy office is based. But historically, the state energy office didn't have tons of programming related to renewables. In 2019, they decided to buy out this survey that the University of Michigan does with local governments across the state. We have 1,856 cities, counties, townships, and villages. So the survey goes to the top elected and appointed official in all of them. And the purpose of this survey for the 2019 and then again in 2023 version is to understand what it is that how local officials thought about their role in the context of a range of energy issues. We heard back, as we often do, from about 73% of jurisdictions. And so we use that to effectively help write recommendations to EGLE about how they could support local governments, again, across that urban-rural spectrum. It informed their grant making, and it also informs our programming and subsequently what has become kind of the Renewable Energy Academy. One of the other, if you go to the next slide, Madeline, one of the other foundational resources that we did is to establish the Michigan zoning database. So this was before the housing atlas got off the ground. At this point back in 2019, it was unclear to planners across the state who was actually responsible for land use planning. We have a complex system where the right of first refusal for zoning is given to townships. If they choose not to zone, then the county has the option to zone. And if they choose not to zone, then the place is unzoned. So it's pretty much a land use free-for-all. And if you're going to try to encourage communities to think proactively about an up-and-coming land use, such as renewable energy, you kind of need to know who has responsibility, which local government you need to talk to. And so we first tried to figure out who was responsible for zoning, but then also collect and read those zoning ordinances. Another important element to know about Michigan's planning and zoning is that if a zoning ordinance is silent on a land use in Michigan, it means that land use is assumed to not be allowed. So back at this time, zoning for renewable energy was exclusively the purview of local governments. And so silence in a zoning ordinance was effectively blocking a project. In our first pass, we went through again and collected those ordinances, figured out who had addressed large and small scale wind and solar. We then went through 2 years later after doing some programming that we'll talk about to understand whether that had changed, whether more people were taking up zoning. And we found that yes, indeed, they were. Particularly solar, more folks between 2019 and 2021 added solar to their zoning ordinance. Additional communities added wind to their zoning ordinance. Even so, even currently, we still had about 25% of jurisdictions across the state that were completely silent on renewables of all scales, small and large, both technologies. And so that continued to be a barrier and kind of laid the groundwork, as Madeline will discuss, for some policy changes that came in 2023. The other thing to note, again, most of the time, Madeline and I are going to talk about Michigan because we're funded mostly by the Michigan Energy Office. But we do have some other funding, including from DOE, and certainly tools that are relevant. So one of the things that we did with some DOE funding in 2022, 2023 is expand this zoning database to the 6 states in the Great Lakes region that you can see here on the right. What we find is that silence is still pretty prevalent in these states. So if it's shown in pink, this effectively means that they do not mention large-scale solar. The other thing, though, is that we did a really deep dive in this research project to understand how it is that they treat large-scale solar. And I know that many of these states have state-level siting authority, but we looked at the largest scale that local government was responsible for. We read for the setback distances. We read to understand if they disallow solar in ag zones. What we find is that there are really very few explicit bans. And all things considered, not super hefty, not lots, like over-regulated, I would say, or like extremely regulated solar. It certainly constrains kind of the buildability, the amount of large solar projects that you would be able to build. But generally speaking, in a lot of places, especially in places where zoning is set up permissively, like in Michigan, silence is the bigger barrier than actual exclusionary zoning ordinances. Okay. Another thing that we did in our Michigan programming, once we established who in Michigan was responsible for zoning, we also wanted to create an online repository of resources that we could point people to encourage proactive planning and zoning. So I intentionally used the words curate because there's a lot of stuff out there and available. And what we wanted to do for planners and for local governments is to say, if you only read 3 things, what are the 3 things that you would read? And what are the things that seemed balanced or more nuanced? And so we curated these. We will be sharing the slides so you can have all of the hyperlinks to be able to check out what's available here in Michigan. And so we just have a handful of wind and solar resources, planning and zoning resources that we pulled together, but we also have an extended like Google sheet that has a whole bunch of other resources that if you're particularly interested in understanding engagement mechanisms, you can go and find resources that are about that, or how to zone for small scale solar. Like it will point you to those resources. We also commissioned some case studies and just 2-page, sometimes 3-page fact sheets about really frequent questions that we were hearing in communities about renewables. Once we curated things, we were able to identify where there were holes in resources available. And so back in 2020, the state of Michigan didn't have guidance for zoning for large-scale solar energy. And so we worked in combination with Michigan State University Extension to create planning and zoning for solar energy systems. I actually have the old copy on my desk here. The first half of this guidebook is kind of lay of the landscape for what is why Michigan communities were being approached by solar developers and also what the technology is like. And the second half is and was fill in the blank zoning ordinance. We updated the guide. It just came out 2 weeks ago, 3 weeks ago. So that's the screenshot that you see up on the screen in light of policy changes. And one of the things that we've been doing is with state funding is being able to mail a hard copy book like the one I just showed you to all local governments. The Michigan Association of Planning is getting ready to mail, 1,300 copies to any local government that has a planning commission. We also did a bit of programming around this, and so I'll talk about that more in some subsequent slides. Once we come out with a new resource, we also pair it with a webinar and in-person events, including bus tours that we've done with MAP. I also want to point you to a resource that's now almost a year old, but we're still really proud of it. And that is our battery energy storage guide, also printed out on my desk here. This is one where very often Madeline and I try to borrow from other states. We think that we're kind of ahead of the curve on this. We borrowed a lot from New York State, and there's some other resources, but we think that in terms of a comprehensive guide to what you need to know about battery energy storage systems across all scales, including the largest scale, and again, kind of what you might consider in zoning, you can find it in this guide. So if your state hasn't given much thought to battery energy storage, we really encourage you to check out this guide, and we're happy to talk more about that too. Okay, with understanding who's responsible for zoning, some curated and new tools in hand, effectively in 2022, we launched what we call the Renewable Energy Academy. It started as something that was really housed at the University of Michigan. It's subsequently migrated to Eagle, to the State Energy Office. But what this is a one-stop shop kind of hub for large-scale renewable energy. So we have tailored trainings, webinars, workshops connecting experts and peers. This is the online hub, effectively hosts the resources and guides and tools, but we also offer individual technical assistance to local officials and planners. And I want to walk you through kind of some of a great example of how this has played out in some places. So, and I'll actually get to some of the content about what we tell communities in terms of planning and zoning for renewables. So a great example of this multi-part training series that we do as part of the Renewable Energy Academy is with NEMCOG, which is the Northeast Michigan Council of Governments. This, as you'll see, was a 4-part series. The first part was a 2.5 hour in-person workshop that was an introduction to planning and zoning for wind and solar, effectively trying to establish for communities in Michigan why they should be planning or replanning for renewable energy if they had already considered it a couple of years ago. But we knew from reading zoning ordinances that they hadn't. And certainly in their master plans, they had not contemplated this widely. And then we really focused on community impacts of solar. And then we talked about like the basic principles for planning for clean energy. On the next slide, you'll see our approach to introducing communities to renewable energy. First of all, is to show maps of the interconnection queues for utility scale, to let them know like this is coming. This is something that developers are interested in Michigan. Sometimes there's a misnomer that Michigan isn't sunny enough for this. But really, we want them to be thinking about what are the local benefits and local concerns, because when we're thinking about establishing kind of planning and zoning, that's often the thing that comes into play. So in terms of local benefits, it's important, we talk about the landowner payments that developers provide to those who host solar on their property, property tax payments and developer donations that are made. We give this a little bit of caveat because developer donations are not ubiquitous, and so you may not count on those. And in terms of property tax payments, particularly for newer technologies, there can be in flux, and so we give that a little caveat. We talk about jobs because a lot of people talk about jobs, but when we give it, we talk about the caveat that for solar, which is we're showing on this slide, there's a lot of jobs during construction, Many of them are held by locals, at least our experiences in the state of Michigan, but there are relatively few long-term jobs in that host community. There are lots in the solar industry generally, but in terms of the long-term jobs in the community that has the solar farm, there are fewer of those. Down kind of in the gap there, you'll see water quality and pollinator potential are something that we also talk about, or sustainability goals. Honestly, many of the communities that are being asked to host solar farms, these are less attractive to them. Maybe I should have reordered this. My PhD is really on wind. And most people who host wind farms in their community or wind turbines on their property don't necessarily do it for climate reasons. They do it more for the economics. And so we kind of meet communities where they are and don't often talk kind of about those potential benefits necessarily for solar. But it's important to us also to make sure that we're talking about local concerns. So in terms of wildlife, this is a construction activity and can disrupt habitats during construction, so long as those flora and fauna have places to go where it's around. The sense is that they will come back after the project is constructed. With the kind of caveat about like, right now, we're looking at solar fences and deer, which deer are not a protected species, but in Michigan, they're held in the public trust. And so it's led to lots of interesting questions that if you want to talk more about, ask about it in the Q&A. Uh, Honestly, I think what's driving a lot of local concerns is about visual impacts, both outright. Usually it tends to be drive-by impacts rather than kind of the more visible impacts of wind, but also on property values. There continues to be questions. And while there's some research on this now, not enough, particularly at the scale of the solar farms that we're seeing, at least in our part of the country. Very often we hear about this is not why I moved here, in terms of a change to the landscape. And we also talk a lot about local concerns about whether this is a wise use of land and impacts on tenant farmers. And I'm going to save how we talk about farmland preservation for a couple slides later, because that's, for better or for worse, like what I think about a lot. If you go on, Madeline, to the next slide, this is about wind. Many of the benefits are the same in terms of landowner payments and tax payments. The jobs that we talk about there tends to actually be during construction, not necessarily local jobs in Michigan because it's a specialized crew, but actually once the project is built, more jobs on a kind of megawatt basis than what you see for solar. Local concerns are similar, though noise and health often come up in communities. And so we try to bring the research to show kind of what we know about health impacts about wind. Wildlife, again, this is where birds and bats come into play and kind of recognizing that wind turbines can pose, can kill birds and bats. And a lot of it depends on what location they're sited in and how they're operated. We talk about visual impacts, and again, the kind of not why I moved here. And then finally, on battery energy storage, in terms of the local benefits, the footprint of battery energy storage facility is a lot smaller than either of those technologies, whether you're measuring that on a megawatt basis or just straight up. I mean, a solar farm, the average scale solar farm coming to Michigan is about 1,300 acres. You can have like the average battery energy storage facility is about 7 to 15, like much, much smaller. And so small footprint with potentially a big tax payment, but there's a caveat that the state is still kind of sorting out in this state how to tax best. There's also the landowner payment, though at least what we're seeing is that land, rather than being leased, is more commonly purchased from the landowner. This could be because of the smaller footprint and opportunity for brownfields, and depending on where battery energy storage connects in, it may provide grid reliability benefits at the local level if it's connecting into the distribution grid. At the transmission scale, which is where more large scale BESS are connecting in, it's providing overall grid benefits, but they might not be localized. Again, jobs To be honest, we don't know because right now, the first really big BESS project is under construction in the state of Michigan. And so that is something, how many jobs there are afterwards to be determined. The sense is that there's not somebody sitting there every day. And so probably even less than an FTE in the host community. Local concerns for BESS are similar. Visual impacts, it reads a lot like storage containers or like a substation activity. That's what it looks like. There's sound impacts. The inverter and fan and cooling fans do emit sound. And so that can certainly have an impact. There's some questions about it, environmental impacts, but the one that gets a lot of play is about fire or explosion risk. And so in our guide, and when we're talking to communities, we try to put that in context and also say, here are the things that you need to do. Make sure that your emergency responders know what to do in case of an emergency. And P.S., this is something that is heavily suggested or even required in the National Fire Protection Policy, NFPA. Okay. Next slide. Okay. Going back to NEMCOG, Northeast Michigan, Renewable Energy Academy. Our first was kind of the deep dive or the kind of introduction to the things that you might consider between these technologies. Our second was really kind of advanced planning and zoning, and really focusing in on the planning aspect. And this, in Michigan, the newest thing really at this time was solar. And so we really dug into what it is that solar developers are looking for and how you should think about solar in the context of your goals analysis and compatibility with existing goals. So here we're showing there's a map that's available through Argonne National Labs GEM tool. If you're not familiar with this, you should. You can see all of the transmission lines and also substations. And so effectively, energy infrastructure, large-scale energy infrastructure wants to go to those points. And so helping local governments understand that that's where developers are going to look first is really important. If you go to the next slide, great. The other thing is trying to, again, think about these technologies as they fit with common planning goals. So here we've got an expanded version of this that talks about small scale wind and solar. But here we're just really focusing on the large utility scale version. And if you're thinking, for example, if a goal for a district or for your community is mixed use, walkability, and enhancing neighborhoods, none of this technology is that great or engaging to walk by. And the footprint, again, makes that challenging. If we go down a couple of rows and we're thinking about tourism development and view sheds, wind is certainly a change in the view shed, right? And so it may be incompatible in many environments with kind of a goal towards really going all in on tourism development. Energy storage, on the other hand, is not. Again, the battery enclosures are typically under 14 feet, like max. And so this is not something that is really going to noticeably change kind of the view. Solar, depending on its scale and kind of the landscape and how well it's screened, could have an impact, could not. It really depends for that one. We introduced this as a starting point. We'll talk about this later. We're working on a planning guide. What our experience is that very often communities have been reactionary and haven't actually gotten going in terms of thinking about energy until it's too late, until the developer is there knocking on a door. So what I think I want to quickly walk over, though, is something that comes up a lot in terms of thinking about goals. Many places in Michigan have goals for farmland preservation. And particularly associated with solar, the question is solar a new threat or is it a new opportunity for farmers? And what we encourage communities to think about is, what do you mean by farmland preservation? What is it that you're trying to preserve? If you have the planning school kind of definition of farmland preservation and you're thinking about an urban boundary, solar on that property is occupying that land for 30 years. It's common to have a decommissioning standard. And so the idea is that those panels could be removed. You're not going to be building a residential development during the life of the project on that land. And so it could be actually holding firm that urban boundary. Solar and actually any of these technologies tend to not have demands on urban services, but they are contributing to taxes. How much they contribute varies from state to state. And that's a side project of one of the things that we do here, really deep dive into property taxes. And so we do have a new 8-state deep dives for Great Lakes states plus Nebraska, and Iowa. So if you're interested, you can check out the link when you get the slides. Sometimes, actually more commonly, I think though, when local governments have farmland preservation in their master plans, they're actually thinking about preserving a rural vista. And makes it a little bit trickier. Again, for solar, the impacts might be just drive-by, except when we're talking at scales of thousands of acres, or if you're this farmstead and the solar is on all 3 sides of your property and across the street, that can change the rural vista. And so I think that's often what communities are responding to. Sometimes communities want to preserve farmland in order to preserve habitat. And I already talked about the idea that construction is the biggest disruptor in terms of that, but actually, depending on what you plant in and around solar panels, you could be creating additional habitat. Small creatures like this fox in the picture can get through the fence that's often put around the solar farm. Rarely, at least in our experience in rural Michigan, is it a chain link fence. Instead, it's kind of more field fence or farm fence, which allows smaller creatures to get through. But even more tricky is how is these last 2 goals. So if what you mean by farmland preservation is preserving land for growing food, there are different approaches to this. So I first want to acknowledge that agrivoltaics exists. This is mixing solar and agriculture at the same time. Grazing is possible at scale now, and it's happening. A limitation often is finding enough sheep or sheep farmers. But growing other crops, at least at scale, is pretty niche for the medium term. As planners, one of the things that we encourage communities to think about is whether solar is reversible. And what we would say is it depends a lot on the land use requirements. If you're requiring berming, or you're requiring creating stormwater detention basins, you're moving a whole lot of topsoil that's probably not going to be farmed in the future. Making sure that you have decommissioning in place is a way to make that land reversible. We also get a lot of questions about whether solar panels will contaminate the land if they're broken or because of something in their manufacturing. So we've got some fact sheets on this that you can see what we have to say. Also, there are questions about the long-term impacts of idling land and operation in our part of the country of field tile long-term. And so these are things that we encourage nuanced thinking about, and also thinking about how you think about solar in relation to other things, other land uses that you might allow in your ag district that, again, are not growing food. Golf courses. Solar is certainly more reversible than that. Low density residential development. Finally, the last one is about farm livelihoods. And you both have farmers who are hosting this on their property, but also farmers against solar. And so we're part of just wrapping up a large DOE funded research study to understand how much solar land is leased versus purchased, and what leaseholders are doing with their revenue. Are they supplementing farm income like folks with wind development on their property do? Or is this their retirement strategy? And the punchline is we see stories of both. Also trying to compare solar to kind of ag uh, industry, solar revenue to ag industry, and how that is circulating or not in the local economy. One of the things that the research side has not fully teased apart and that we're working on right now is trying to understand the impacts that large solar developments have on tenant farmers. And so we're happy to talk more about that too. All right. Third part of our four-part Renewable Energy Academy with NEMCOG was renewable energy site tours, where we put people on a bus and take them to multiple energy facilities, always at least one wind farm and one solar farm. But what we find is that taking them to multiple solar facilities or multiple wind farms to see how things can be different is really important. We pay attention to scale and landscape and site design. It's really important for us to get behind the fence, to stand next to the inverters on a solar farm. Some of them are quiet and some of them are not. We have worked with wind developers to make sure that we're allowed to get out of the bus and turn the bus off, but keep those wind turbines spinning so that people can hear what it's like to stand underneath a spinning wind turbine. Then they turn it off so we can go and get a peek actually inside the base of the turbine. But really, I think one of the great parts about the bus tours have been debriefing on the bus and having conversations with local officials in the communities that host these, and also allow for peer-to-peer exchange, what questions communities have. We have developed a guide in association with the Michigan Association of Planning for people who want to organize their own bus tour, kind of taking what we've learned, and it's a checklist. And so again, you can get the link to this. The final and fourth part of the NEMCOG series was really nuts and bolts of zoning. These were all done via online workshops, 2 hours a piece, to bring your own zoning ordinance and effectively like workshop what it was that you were thinking about for accessory use solar and wind, definitions, general provisions. But particularly for utility scale, we broke it down. So for solar, we talked about height, setback, screening, fencing, and how they may work in combination or at cross purposes. We did another one that covered ground cover and stormwater management, lot coverage. If you can't tell, like, we could talk for hours about any of this stuff. And so, but we found that understanding that there's different ways to get at the same goal and better adapting to what local government, what worked in that place, was really helpful for planners. All right. We also do no cost review. Eagle allows us to do no cost review of zoning ordinances. And so our review is effectively saying, how does this fit with your plan goals? We compare it to our templates to see what the local government missed or kind of changed. Our templates are fill in the blank. So like we're agnostic as to what setback distance they choose, but we want to let them know what message it might be sending to developers, or a new requirement that they're adding in, like helping them think through, like making sure that they have the rationale for that, and also thinking a little bit about unintended consequences. All right. That was what we had for the Renewable Energy Academy. We had developed the tools and we still had a number of communities that were not being proactive in thinking about renewables. And the state also had funding available, $25,000 for local government grants to effectively allow to hire consultants to put renewables into their zoning ordinance, and they weren't being taken up. So right around this same time, I had a group of grad students work on their capstone project. It was an 18-month project to figure out how we can increase proactive zoning. What else do you need? You've got money, you've got tools, but the two things are not coming together to lead to more proactive zoning. So they did lots of interviews with local officials, and they piloted a program in 2 communities, and it was awesome. It included the planning guides and the funding, but it really focused on the planning process and how you get people to turn up to do the planning. Providing kind of some technical assistance on where in your community a developer might be looking, but also then what is it that your community really cares about? Like, what are your values and goals, and how might that then translate into your zoning? The other thing that this student team found is that really all of the benefits for renewables came way after project approval. And so communities, and after the project got built and operational, which could be years after site plan approval. And so thinking about how to increase bonus payments. I had 3 of the team of 5 shown here, but there were actually 6 who actually continued. Eagle was so happy with this program that they hired 3 of them to continue on as staff members. And actually, this idea of a bonus turned into a $30 million Renewable Ready Communities Award allocation from the state that provides some flexible funding to local governments to use on road repairs, renovating the town hall or the fire station, playground equipment, whatever the local government wants. And that funding would start to flow when construction begins. So it was, we were right on the cusp of effectively having lots of proactive zoning and planning going on in Michigan. And then there were changes in state law. And so I think that's where Madeline's going to pick up.
Yes, I'm gonna allow you to catch a break, Sarah, and we'll continue carrying the torch here and talk more extensively about the bill package that then came in the fall of 2023. As it happens, you work all of the stuff out and then the law changes. So the Michigan legislature passed an extensive bill package in November of 2023, including on a variety of issues, increasing the cap for rooftop solar and enabling rooftop solar a little bit, and energy efficiency things. But one of the key pieces of that legislation really was the increase of Michigan's renewable energy portfolio standard to now reaching 50% renewable energy by 2030, which is really steep increase, as we're currently floating around 15% renewable. It's a long ways to go. And to reach that, the legislature passed PA Public Act 233, which now enables, or is one of the key strategies to achieving these goals. Alongside not just renewable energy generation related, but also in that same bill package was the Michigan becoming the first Midwestern state to have an energy storage benchmark, which is from basically going from 0 megawatts of energy storage to 2,500 megawatts in the next couple of years. And so PA 233 was kind of the centerpiece of how to achieve these up to renewable energy goals. What PA 233 does is that it creates an option for local for developers, and that's how Michigan differs a little bit to some of the other state siting regimes that we have in the U.S., where the Michigan law is really unique in that it provides developers of big projects. So solar energy projects over 50 megawatts, energy storage projects over 50 megawatts / 200 megawatt hours, and wind energy projects over 100 megawatts, with the option to go through the state, but it doesn't mandate the state, or it doesn't make a developer go through the state. It just provides an option alongside the local path, the regular good local zoning process. So PA 233 now has created this option for developers to seek a permit with the Michigan Public Service Commission, the MPSC, unless a local government has a compatible renewable energy ordinance, or a CREO, which is pretty much a pre-written ordinance with standards spelled out in the law, what the setbacks should be, what the sound standards, or an ordinance can't be more restrictive than those standards spelled out in the law. So basically giving guardrails to local renewable energy ordinances. The law came or was passed in the fall of 2023 and then became effective in 2024. So for the last half a year or so, this is now an option present to developers. And there are some disclaimers at the bottom of this slide where we often need to remind communities that this is not equaling eminent domain. There's still a voluntary landowner in place, but like Sarah mentioned, we're trying to figure out better how common is it actually that the developer becomes the landowner because they're buying the land versus leasing the land. And then there are also some exceptions that apply to Michigan cities and villages if a project were entirely located within that city or village, which may be more relevant for battery storage projects given their smaller footprint than solar and wind. But this exception does not extend to the townships where most of the development goes. So to be frank, if Sarah and I were able to make the rules, this would not be the law that would have passed. And Sarah wasn't shy to express her opinions about this even ahead of the law being passed, that the way siting in Michigan had worked up till now is broken. And I recommend you reading her op-ed, which you've linked in the slide as well, just pointing at the unproportional burden that rural governments or rural communities in Michigan are carrying to achieve those state goals and ambiguities in the Michigan Zoning Enabling Act and more. And as rumblings about addressing siting challenges in Michigan became louder, months prior to PA 233 making it into the legislature, the Michigan Association of Planning actually leveraged the collective experience we have in the state to spearhead work on drafting alternative bill language that would have provided for a more planning-centric alternative, which would honor existing planning and zoning more and balance state and local priorities. I'm presenting these slides because if Sarah were presenting these, she could tell you a lot about her opinions on that. And so if you have any questions, feel free to pop that in the chat too. Yet we try to be constructive, and as PA 233 was kind of the new reality of the land, we really try to get involved in the implementation of the law. So during that year between the law passing and it becoming effective, we actively participated in several stakeholder engagement sessions with MPSC staff as they were trying to figure out how implementation of that law would work, how they would process applications that come their way. Where Sarah and I advocated for best practices in siting and shared our experience from working with local governments since 2019. So as MPSC staff was working on putting together their guiding documents, they shared straw proposals along the way on different issues such as decommissioning or sound, to which they sought feedback, and Sarah and I happily provided feedback. Some of the other things that we provided feedback on were like, how does public input work in the state process? And where in the process do you have community engagement? And is it too late at that point already to even meaningfully change or influence a project? How can community planning find a role into the state process, site plans, etc.? So yet again, Sarah pulls also together another brilliant group of students at the University of Michigan, this time with the Taubman School of Urban Planning. So planning students to support the MPSC with best practices by corralling some of the lessons learned from other states that have state permitting. And their results, summarized in their Power in Partnerships report, actually won yet another student award. Sarah didn't mention that earlier, but both capstone projects, the My Ready project and this one, were recognized by APA and MAP, which is exciting. So we continue kind of trying to inform the MPSC's work as they're preparing to start receiving applications coming through the state pipeline process. But in the meantime, we also had a ton of communities asking us, what does this law mean? What does it mean to us? How do I need to adjust my zoning ordinance? So we started to develop tools and resources specifically for local governments to implement this. And the resources we developed continue to live on our website. We have, for example, an overview slide deck of what the law means, which projects it applies to, what are the options local governments have, trying to really focus on being constructive in what can you do about this now. We got checklists that we developed for local governments navigating the MPSC process. If a local government finds themselves in a situation where the developer has taken the project to the state, what do they need to consider? And similarly, we developed such a checklist for the CREO process as well, the compatible renewable energy process as well that this law created. We have samples CREO zoning language where we basically just translate these standards that are pre-written in the law into an ordinance format for making it easier on the local governments. So the law lays out these two pathways, right? It's this newly created concept of a compatible renewable energy ordinance, which is an ordinance guardrailed or constrained by the law itself. And then the Michigan Public Service Commission path, or the state permitting pathway, which is new now, and which is constrained by those same setbacks and sound standards, et cetera, that are spelled out in the law, but it's beefed up a little bit more compared to the CREO, as the Michigan Public Service Commission also, on top of the CREO standards, considers or added additional conditions that the staff would hold projects to once they come to the state. Some of those, for example, get its screening, or some things like that. There's additionally evaluation criteria that the law actually stipulates the MPSC to consider, and we'll talk a little bit more about this, or I would love to talk to you more about this in the end, but things like the commission to consider the impact on farmland, which, like Sarah already laid out, hot topic, or the percentage of land in a jurisdiction that's already dedicated to energy generation. So it's yet to be seen a little bit how the commission will decide on these things, but it's in the law that those shall be considered. So as we know from our zoning database that Sarah mentioned earlier, we knew that we basically had 0 CREOs in the state. All ordinances in the state were incompatible, aka more restrictive in some way, either because the sound standard was more protective, or because a zoning ordinance actually limits the location of where a project can go. So that makes for more than 2 pathways. The law doesn't stipulate that the local government has to have a CREO. You only have to have a CREO if you want to lock in that the developer comes to you first, rather than going to the state. So there is a pathway for a community to have an ordinance in place that is not meeting those compatibility requirements. It's not a CREO, but a developer may actually still prefer working locally through that incompatible ordinance than going through the state process. And you can see here a little bit how we typically communicate this to local governments. In the year that we had to prep communities between law is signed and now it's in effect, to really kind of lay out the options, what they mean, and the pros and cons of each path. Why are we making this distinction about workable ordinances, you may ask? Well, like I said, it's a local government doesn't have to have a CREO. It's just the only option that locks in that the process can stay local. And we really have, in conversations with developer and now observing too, as communities are preparing for projects, really understood that PA 233 is a backstop. It's not the first choice of developers in Michigan to go through the state, because kind of in line with nationwide survey data, it is a more expensive, a more time intensive, and also an unpopular pathway to go to the state compared to making it work locally. So to kind of sum it up from a developer's perspective, a CREO is a pretty, it's a top preference for developers because it's cheap, it's pre-written, it's quick, it goes through the local process with guardrail standards. But a workable ordinance is actually next best. If it's a truly workable ordinance, meaning it allows for development, even if it doesn't meet those strict CREO standards, then that is the next best thing. And only when the local government process stalls or an ordinance is too restrictive would then the developer kind of pivot to the state permitting process when an ordinance is unworkable. So we've tried to come up with, how do we concisely, this seems all very complicated, how can we actually concisely describe this to local governments? And sometimes I find the analogy of having the CREO as kind of the floor. It's the most basic ordinance you could imagine. And the MPSC process is kind of what a developer would have to go through, kind of at the ceiling. So workable ordinance is really trying to find that sweet spot of adding more protective items to a local zoning ordinance than a CREO can do, without kind of tipping the scale and making a developer go to the state process. To look at kind of we wanted to inform local governments more with what does this mean workable? And we honestly kind of made it up. It's not, the workable ordinance is nothing that appears in the law, but it's a viable option that developers and local governments are now seeking. And so we tried to put our researcher hats on and dug back into the database and pulled out those ordinances that were in place in Michigan when the existing projects that we do have in Michigan were permitted. And we kind of tried to see, okay, how much of a CREO is in these local ordinances? Where or what are the setbacks there? What are the sound standards there? And pulled it all together in a big spreadsheet, and really got the sense that, okay, we have none of these ordinances that led to projects in the past have actually met those CREO standards. They all exceed CREOs in some way. They either have a more restrictive sound standard or they limit the location. But this really gave us an idea of what can perhaps a local government ask for without tipping the scale and have a developer go through the state process. So everyone was redoing their zoning ordinances practically. We noticed a big need for immediate zoning ordinance help because communities were thinking through, okay, which pathway is the right pathway for me? What is the pro of a CREO? What is the con of a CREO? And how do I go about this? So together with Eagle, we set up this big roadshow basically and toured almost 10 planning regions in Michigan and offer workshops for local officials to talk through these options. We've recorded a workshop series that's available on Eagle's website as well. And after kind of covering the basics, similar to what Sarah talked to us about earlier, like the basics of solar, wind, and battery, why is it coming here and what are the local impacts? We really spend a lot of time on zoning options. And what we created was this activity. And I like holding things on the camera as well. So we've basically developed this activity to help people understand what does zoning look like across these pathways. And I want to show you some of these card sets in particular, but the idea of this is building your dream ordinance and then kind of tweaking that muscle of like, okay, what are actually our priorities? If I had to remove a card or if I had to loosen up on one zoning item, which one could that be? Or what are the kind of the key priorities in zoning language terms? So we set up this activity card. We have different card decks. And I have two examples of the card deck that I want to show you. One is how does a sound standard for a solar project look like in a CREO? So if you want to have a CREO, it would be a non-participating sound standard, a 55 dBA LAQ 1 hour measured at the outer wall. In the MPSC process, it's kind of the same. Plus, the Michigan Public Service Commission has signaled that they'll apply a number of conditions of approval, mainly getting it monitoring and compliance in the end. But most ordinances in the state that we've looked at that have led to projects in the past, so like the workable column, we've really seen a wide range of sound standards and also more stricter. So anything between a ambient noise +5 to kind of on the larger or on the more generous end of the spectrum, kind of a 60 dB Lmax. And in the process, we've explained communities, what is the difference between LAQ 1 hour and Lmax? How do different measuring points? Do we measure at the building? Do we measure at the property line? How does that work? And then by contrast, we typically say something that's likely going to be unworkable is asking for a property for a sound standard along the lines of a below 45 dB Lmax. So we kind of just put the range out there. None of this is super precise, but it provides local governments with an idea. Another example of a card that I want to show you is kind of screening, where you can now see in a CREO, you can't add screening because that would make the ordinance more restrictive, aka it wouldn't be a CREO. But the MPSC has signaled that they will consider conditions of approval that do consider screening on a case-by-case basis. And most workable ordinances that we've seen that led to projects have some sort of landscaping in place. So our sense is that asking for some vegetative screening is most certainly workable. And then taking that to the excess is at some point unworkable as well. So that was an example of kind of how we try to respond to the immediate need that we saw of providing zoning support. And along the way, we were rewarded with $2 million from the Department of Energy through the R-STEP grant to effectively modify everything that Sarah's talked about, everything that we've done before PA 233, and update that in light of the new law, but also to develop new tools and to deepen these partnerships that we have had, but deepen these now. And so together with our R-STEP partners, or one of the R-STEP partners being the Michigan Association of Planning, with whom we've done a series of trainings, and because of our enhanced relationship with MAP, and because we're enabled by that DOE funding. So we've in the last couple of months been really busy at it, not only providing workshops for local government officials, but also for planning consultants, and did a couple of those. We've played the activity at the Student MAP conference earlier this year, and DOE funding also allowed us to pretty much buy out the annual MAP Spring Institute and dedicated it entirely to renewable energy, where I think over 120 planners came together to spend all day talking about renewable energy. So in all these, we played the card game. It's very fun. If you want to learn more about that one, let me know. One of the other things, or some of the other things that we can work on now through our step in developing new tools, is actually taking the idea of the card game and putting it into an actual tool and to quantify the trade-offs of different zoning decisions, which is what our partner Five Lakes Energy is currently working on. Another tool that we are currently working on is the Clean Energy Information Bureau, because we keep getting asked about the birds and the bats and deer migration and fire safety risk. And Sarah and I can try our best to answer these questions, but there are people in this state that know so much better. And so we've been trying to corral kind of the super team of Michigan, the expert on sound, the expert on farmland impacts, and that's what we're currently building out, so that we can send local government officials that have questions and need more support on certain topics, or recycling of panels, for example, to those experts, and really build and train the trainers, and build a bigger team of support for local governments. We're also working on new guides and new resources. Next up is actually one on financial planning, because we really see local governments, or we really see there to be a need for clarification on what kind of the key takeaway is for the local government. So we plan, and hopefully by the end of the year, have a guide together that includes kind of the municipal revenue streams that come towards the local government, highlighting that tool that allows us to quantify some of the trade-offs, explain taxation, explain the payment in lieu of taxes option that we have in Michigan for solar projects, and how local governments can think about award use and state grants, and putting everything together in one guide on financial planning. We hope to be able to include some sample language on performance guarantees and decommissioning, because these are like key things that come up too. Eventually, and we kind of wanted to do a guide on master planning first, but then we realized, okay, master planning in light of PA 233 is really confusing, because technically the law doesn't really make or include space for master planning. So that is something that we are excited to kind of try and dig into, and incorporate some of those findings that Sarah, through a different research project, has been working on, this resource of community-centered solar development, where she outlines, together with another team, outlines key steps to help prepare, plan, and conduct successful community conversations about solar. And there we basically, like, we know there are amazing planning resources out there, solar at scale, but really Michiganify those and make it specific to Michigan in light of these things. Okay, that takes us to kind of, now it's your turn. Some of the things that we're still trying to figure out in Michigan is, like I said, how can master planning look like in light of PA 233? Trying to think more about how the Michigan Public Service, the Michigan Public Service Commission can consider impacts on farmland, or kind of a fair share approach of how much do communities share the burden or the need for renewable energy development. And also, we really would love to learn what we can learn, borrow, and adapt from other states. We're thinking about how a network of kindred spirits can kind of look like. So yeah, if you have any questions or feedback on how we can do a better job, or how we can connect and learn from you, we would really love to kind of keep a conversation going. And with that, I will say, please reach out to Sarah and me. We have some time for questions now. So for that, I'll hand it back to Christy.
Wonderful, thanks. And folks, if you do have questions, just type them in that Q&A box, and we will see if we can get to those. All right, we're just gonna go one by one and just get her done. Let's talk a little more about solar grazing. And also, I have to say, and I tried to look for it like 5 or 6 years ago, we had a webinar on goats, and part of it was on just using them on the sides of highways. And then others were, we were talking about like the solar grazing. And it was just really starting to get popular, and folks were kind of on the fence about it. But so it's kind of interesting. I was trying to find the link for it, which I can't. Maybe someone can. If you go onto our YouTube channel, you might find it. But it was just very interesting. So do you see much solar grazing, either sheep eating the flora or the grass at a solar site, or anything else besides sheep, goats, whatever? And what are the drawbacks to that?
It's on the rise. There's actually like a solar grazing association that has worked to kind of create the market and the seed mix, right? You want to make sure that you're going to plant things that sheep like. You don't do goats. Goats are jerks. They jump on the panels and nibble the wires, but sheep are cool. If you want to see where there are sites, Inspire is a website, INSPIRE. If you do that plus like solar, you'll get a map actually of sites across the country where sheep are grazing. I'll say in Michigan, we are at the very earliest stages. We only have small portions of a couple of projects. In part, you have to make sure that the sheep have water there, right? And that you have kind of a sheep herd, local, right? And I think that this is one of the things that we think about a lot. You don't go from, in our area, there's a lot of corn, soybean farmers, from corn, soybean farming to sheep farming overnight, usually. And so you have to plan for this. Also, you need to plan the project for that. And so making sure that solar panel wiring is buried so that it's not kind of cutting off paths between panels is something that's important. So we are seeing more of it. And I think we haven't, there's just the first test case of cattle. We certainly have lots of more cattle grazing in the country in places that are also sunny. But cattle's a little bit trickier just because they like to rub against the solar support posts. And so this is something that certainly there's a lot of attention on, and a lot of research and trial and error going on.
Okay. Let's stick with solar for a minute, and we're not done with the animals here. It says, I didn't catch the negative impacts of solar farms to deer. What is that connection?
It's more
I have a whole thing with deer in my arborvitae anyway. Like,
people
let's
have
just get it
feelings
all
about
out.
deer, right? Exactly. So
Poor deer. It's not their fault. It really
you're
isn't.
right. So The National Electric Code requires that a solar developer put a 6-foot fence with three strands of barbed wire or a 7-foot fence around a solar farm. At 7 feet, many deer can still jump over that. And so in Michigan, the key, but not all will. So a key question that local governments ask or that neighbors ask is, how is this fence going to impact either more grazing on my fields? Because if deer are excluded from a 2,000-acre solar farm, does that mean that now the farmers around have more deer eating their crops on the one hand? Or is it going to alter kind of deer migration to my favorite hunting spots, right? We actually don't know because deer aren't an endangered species. Like, this hasn't been studied. Making it even trickier is that in Michigan, the deer are held in the public trust. And so you're not allowed to prevent their movement. And you're definitely not allowed to what is called entrap them. So if they hop or jump, I guess deer jump, not hop, into your solar farm, you're technically like excluding the public from this public good. And so this is something that, as we're seeing more of these projects, has become an issue. And so we're hoping to do some research putting cameras outside solar projects to understand, what do deer do when they get to that fence? How common is deer crossing? Are there ways that you can change kind of the fence so that deer can jump out if they've gotten inside? Do deer want to go to the solar project because it's lovely habitat, which could be, right? Or like, are they entrapped there? And so lots of questions, and people have big feelings about deer, right? And what either like as a nuisance or as something that's culturally really important, right? And so that's what the comment was about deer. But they're not getting through that fence, right? Like, they're not gonna squeeze through those little, like, I mean, in my part of the state, we call that a deer fence. It's
Yeah,
to exclude the deer.
yeah,
So
right.
yeah.
Okay. All right. Well, let's sidestep over to wind energy for a moment and ask a couple questions about that. And why not just start with an animal related question as it comes to that? So what about whale deaths from wind energy? I know, and we've talked a lot about the birds, and there's another question coming down the line about what can we do with the turbines themselves to distract birds from running into them or whatever. So let's just take a minute to talk about
Whale deaths. So this is really an offshore wind thing, and I regularly tell people, like, I'm a land use planner.
Got it.
So
Yeah. You do the land wind, not the sea
I do
wind.
the land wind. So I'll be honest that I have not I know about this debate. I have not followed it to be able to speak at all intelligently about it.
That's okay. And then, so
Sorry.
to that, then can we talk about painting stripes on wind turbine blades to prevent or reduce bird deaths? I don't know. Is that a thing?
So I have seen that painting stripes is common in some other countries, not super common here. And so I'll be honest that I don't know why. The US does have the Renewable Energy Wildlife Institute, which is funded by wind industry and environmental NGOs, including like the ones that care about birds and bats, to collaboratively figure out like what are the impacts and how to develop technology to minimize and eliminate wildlife impacts. I'll just say, more often what I have heard, rather than the painting, is instead thinking about the location that you put the turbines in. Again, avoiding kind of fly-through areas, but also at particular wind speeds, bats are often a bigger challenge than birds, to be really honest. And at low wind speeds, there can be lots more bat deaths and also not great energy production. So actually stopping the turbines at those lower speeds where they're not generating tons of wind power anyway, as a kind of a mitigation. They also have I've seen presentations on this. I don't know how widely it is used, but you can put radar up kind of around the perimeter of the wind farm that can see big large birds coming or flocks of birds to effectively turn those turbines off? This is not the question, but fun fact,
Right.
radar is also used to, can be deployed to put on the outskirts of the wind farm to effectively only turn those blinking red lights that the FAA requires so
Yeah.
planes don't hit them on,
Yeah.
only turn those red lights on when aircraft come in the vicinity. Michigan's new PA 233 siting law requires that for projects that go through the state level siting path. And some other states, I think North Dakota may also require that. And so it's a technology that's available for that particular kind of impact to mitigate that impact.
Okay. Um, let us talk about the wind, the solar, and the battery energy storage systems. And this question is it more common to select one or the other because of its power generation potential? Is that the primary check, I guess, for which one to choose, like which one in this space is going to produce better energy? Or is it because of revenue or available land, or is it politically driven? Like, if we're thinking about installing some form of like this alternative energy, which one do we look at first? The potential, like, is the space good? Do we have the space? Is it generally politically driven that someone is like, I would like this in our community? What is it? Or is it just developers coming in and saying, we are buying this land and we are doing what we're doing?
Yeah, and like sometimes they buy it, sometimes they lease it.
Yes, sure.
Um,
Yes.
Connection to the grid is important for all three of them. So if you are a community that has a connection to the transmission grid, you should think that you will at some point be approached to host a large scale energy project. Very often, the same places, honestly, storage can go in lots of different places because of its footprint and because like it doesn't really require anything other than a connection to the grid and some land. Really where storage is possible is driven by electricity markets. And so we don't have time to get into RTOs, but there's a number of different electricity markets in the country that have and or state policies that are more or less preferable to energy storage. For wind and solar, solar is viable in lots of places and there's not huge differences in resources. So again, most of the places where that have connection to the grid could, given the cost of solar coming down, be viable for solar. And for wind, that is where site location makes a big difference. Modern wind turbines are taller and have bigger rotor diameters, which make them economically viable in more places. But even so, I would say it's rarely the community choosing. It's instead a developer saying, energy market seems like, or this state, or this developer or this big user of power wants wind or solar or storage. You've got a connection to the grid and I can find willing landowners to host this on their property. So that's why I'm knocking on your door.
Okay, thank you. I am right now because I can't do two things at once, so we're doing it right now. All right, I just put a YouTube link in the chat. We had a great session at the very beginning of 2024 on battery energy storage systems. Like the whole hour and a half was on that. So I'm just putting that in there. I'm still looking for the goat one. I'll find it eventually. Let's talk about decommissioning. Have we seen any successful decommissionings of any of these? I'm going to start with at least solar and then maybe the battery energy storage systems.
I
Have we
would
seen that
say,
successfully?
okay, so Michigan's oldest solar farm is only like 8 years old. And we really focus here, so we haven't seen it. There were
What's
some
the
early
life? What is the life of any of them?
minimum, like usually they're signing leases for 30 years. The idea is that they probably will be much longer. Sometimes for wind, people say 25 years.
Okay.
So wind projects have started to get decommissioned and or repowered. So you take down or take off like the older technology and put up new. We've seen that. Actually, I'm a Michigander. I'm gonna pull out my hand because
Thank
this
you.
is Michigan.
Always. Yep.
Up by the Mackinac Bridge, there
Yeah.
were two wind turbines that were constructed early 2000s. Those came down earlier this year. So those have been
Okay.
decommissioned. Um, I tell communities, and because I'm a planner, I don't think our need for renewable energy is going anywhere. It's wise to have decommissioning in place so that if for some reason the developer walks away, you know that that equipment can be taken down. And I would more anticipate that these sites will be repowered. If you've got a connection to the grid and land control, just like people don't take cell towers down very often, I cannot imagine that
Sure.
we're going to be taking down too much, but instead I think we'll be repowering.
Okay. This is a good one. This is a good question here. Do you work with any land conservancies or land trusts in Michigan, or have heard in other states? If you don't, if you've heard, many land trusts in Michigan also collaborate with local government in Michigan, related solar sites, and the desire to preserve land for habitats and farmland. And land trusts are competing with solar companies and offering use of their land for solar farms versus preserving their land. So, can you talk? Can we dive into that a little bit?
Yeah, Madeline, do you want to talk about it or you want me to talk about it? Okay. Um, so we've actually worked with the local conservation district who has a kind of a program. We haven't necessarily worked with land trusts, but this is real. So our local conservation district was reaching out to landowners to see if they would be interested in farmland preservation, and they were like, we're getting approached by solar developers. And solar developers are willing to pay quite a hefty price, at least right now in the state. And so thinking through kind of what the options are, I think is really important. What I regularly tell people is like farmland preservation and solar issues are complicated, right? It really depends on what you mean by farmland preservation. My PhD is not in energy. My PhD is in farmland preservation. And so if this urges a new conversation about land preservation and thinking about how we are going to conserve land for ecosystems and how we're going to generate energy, and how we can stack some of those, I think I'm all here for it. I know that there's some conversations among land trusts thinking through like what their priorities are in terms of land preservation and what energy priorities are. So maybe, for example, it doesn't make sense to preserve the land around a transmission substation if that's the prime place that an energy where it would be cheapest to connect in energy. Or maybe if you kind of don't want to see energy in your place, like that is the place where you make sure that people, like you're getting more easements signed up. I know, so many places that have underfunded their kind of land conservation. And so maybe this is spurring more of that. This is evolving right now.
Sure.
Or emerging.
Before we began, I told you that I wouldn't get into politics, but it looks like I'm getting into politics just a little itty bitty bit. And that all I'm saying is because of the decrease in a lot of federal funding, a lot of federal incentives across the board for folks in and around our profession, is there concern about continuing this? Will funds disappear? Will grants disappear? In
For
terms
continuing what? Like our
continuing
work
the
or
work,
like renewable energy?
renewable energy, the big
So
up at the top.
yeah.
We're going just
So
up at the top.
yeah. So there right now, people in the renewable energy space are very concerned about federal tax credits. Renewable, like those were set to expire at the beginning of the Biden administration and like were renewed and certainly created a bigger market. There was already a whole bunch of energy development happening before the Inflation Reduction Act and and what is the other one called? The bipartisan infrastructure law, a whole bunch of it happening, in part because these technologies are cheaper. Also, it's happening because there's a whole bunch of states that have policies, like Michigan now, that require the utilities to do that. And I would also say, kind of, this is in reverse order. In Michigan, before the laws were changed at the end of 2023, requiring utilities to procure a whole lot more renewables, even before that, the utilities have been doing their long range forecasting for keeping the lights on at an affordable cost. We're calling for pretty much the same amount of renewables. They planned to get 50% renewables by 2040 rather than 2030, but they were calling for it anyway. And all of that was before federal tax credits. So will there be a slowdown? Absolutely. Has there already been a slowdown? Yes. And certainly for offshore wind, right? And when people think about like what options are to not just power our current grid with that is aging, but also when we put data centers in the mix, right? And like the future demands of that, like renewables very often are the cheapest option. And certainly the one that like, you know what the cost is right now, whereas you don't necessarily know the cost of fuel for natural gas in the future.
Thanks to someone who typed in and found my goat video. So thank you. I just put
Awesome.
it in the
Goats.
chat. Those stinker
Sorry
goats.
to whoever gave the goat video, like that I said goats are jerks.
Well, I meant they kind of are though, but that's just part of their personality, I guess. That's why we love them. So, okay, it's just about 2:30. So we have to wrap up. There's still a ton of great questions, and I'm sorry, folks, that we couldn't get to all of them. But this was a wonderful discussion, and I thank you both for joining us today, and to the APA Michigan chapter for hosting. Folks, don't forget to log your CM credits and register for all of our upcoming sessions at ohioplanning.org/planning webcast. And we will have the recording up on our YouTube channel soon, and we will have the slide deck available. Sarah or Madeline, if one of you could just email me a PDF of it, and I'll be sure to get it up on our website.
And then
All right,
that gives
folks.
people our contact information.
So you can
reach
finish
out to
all
us.
those questions. There you go.
Exactly.
All
Thank
right.
you
Well,
so much for
thanks
having us.
everybody. Have a great weekend, and we'll talk next time. Bye-bye.